Hi everyone, good morning. Sorry about that. Had a little bit of technical issue, you know how Zoom is sometimes. Anyway, everyone, welcome again. Welcome to today's episode of Singapore FinTech Festival Green Shoot Series. My name is Gabriel, your host for today's session. Also, by the way, this is also our finale. It's also the last Green Shoot session of the year. For those of you that have been with us the last few months, obviously, we do this nearly on a weekly basis. We thank you for your support. We thank you for joining us. We thank you for interacting. But those of you who are joining us for the first time, never too late, right? All right, Green Shoots by the SFF team covers a spread of topics in the fintech space. And once again, it is supported by Temasek this year. Now, before we begin properly, just some quick announcements, especially pertaining to Singapore FinTech Festival, right? Just a quick reminder, we are back again from the 8th to the 12th of November with speakers and agenda now live on the website. Do check us out, and we've got updates coming thick and fast. Used to be on a weekly basis, but now do our updates on the website when it comes to agenda, new sponsors, new updates, new activities which we are doing coming on a near daily basis, right? 1 month to go, so it's almost crunch time for us. Tickets are still available. Early bird rate nearly about $50, and for an extra $10 this year, we've got something really, really special for you, which can basically upgrade and take part in our global knowledge certification program in Web 3.0 this year. Now, what exactly is that? It's simply a certificate that certifies you, to be Web 3.0 ready. All you have to do is you go onto the SFF event platform, and over the next 9 months, you can answer selected sessions, answer some questions, get a passing mark, which is 60%, and you'll be issued a cert. And this cert is not just by us. It's also issued in conjunction with the Asian Institute of Digital Finance, NUS, National University of Singapore, and Group, MasterCard, and many more. To find out more, just visit us at fintechfestival.sg. And now, today will be the fourth and final part of the digital currency series, co-organized with BIS and supported by Temasek. Today's session will focus on standards and interoperability in the journey to ubiquitous adoption of digital currencies. Now, over 60%, right, you got it right, 60% of central banks all around the world are actively experimenting in central bank digital currencies today, better known as CBDCs. Successful domestic CBDC projects have naturally progressed towards cross-border payments, where CBDCs offer significant potential cost and most importantly, time saving through direct transactions without the need for a third party or an intermediary. As we reach a critical mass of cross-border CBDC projects designing for interoperability becomes ever more so important. Now, how do we design this? And what are the different perspectives to consider? Will the emergence of new connectivity models such as multi-CBDC shared platforms being explored in projects like Project Dunbar change the way we think about standards and interoperability? Importantly, how do we build towards a future where international payments are seamless and efficient as our domestic payments today? To share more, not on me, I would like to introduce our speakers right now. We've got Brian Bellendorf from Hyperledger. We've got Jason Thompson, newly appointed CEO from Partio. We've got probably one of the most familiar faces I think a lot of us have seen from WEF, none other than Sheila Warren from the World Economic Forum. Last but not least, again, one of the key brands, I think, in the enterprise space. Representing them is Ricardo Carrera from R3. Leading today is my friend, also very close partner of ours at BIS Innovation Hub, none other than Andrew McCormick. He will be leading today's session. And by the way, once the session starts, we'll be open to online Q&A, which question and answer. You can send your answers via Zoom. If you look at the bottom of the screen, a bit on the right-hand side, right? And you can key in your questions. The panel will try and answer them towards the end of the session. Now, without further ado, let me hand over the time to Andrew. Andrew, please go ahead.
Thank you, Gabriel, and welcome, and thank you all for joining the digital currency series today on standards and interoperability. As Gabriel mentioned, over 60% of central banks are actively experimenting on central bank digital currencies. And as we do reach this critical mass of cross-border CBDC projects, we believe that designing for interoperability is more important than ever. So in this session, we brought together this esteemed group of panelists to discuss defining interoperability and how it benefits the customer, blockchain interoperability, and standards for this emerging multi-CBDC model. So we'll start with this construct of interoperability, which is a big word. And I'll start with you, Sheila, in terms of how the World Economic Forum defines interoperability. I'll note that you guys have a paper coming out sometime this month, which is entirely dedicated to this topic. So I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts and impact in terms of how interoperability is defined and how it would impact users. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And it's such a pleasure to be here today with this esteemed group of panelists. You know, I think there's this general tendency to think of interoperability as really only being about technology and having a technical perspective and aspect to it. And one of the points we raise in this paper is to say that any technology, and DLT or a blockchain is no exception, doesn't solve all the challenges around interoperating. It solves challenges around technical perspectives sometimes. It means that systems can leverage common messaging formats, for example, or protocol or identifiers. Identity is one, which can enable seamless payment transfers between users that hold different digital currency types, but it doesn't address some of the challenges that arise from joint governance and ownership. And so we identify in this paper 4 different perspectives we think are really important and need to be considered when you're kind of looking at what we call the enabling environment within which interoperability needs to operate. So the first, as I mentioned, is of course technical, and that is critical to the consideration of interoperability. The next we talk about is a business perspective. So thinking about what is the interaction that issuers and users need to have with these various types of systems. So in order to offer end users a resilient infrastructure and efficient payment instruments, we need to think about how these are open, standards-based, accessible, affordable, secure, and always available, basically. But there are business models and considerations that have to come into play here when you're looking at from the user perspective. Then, of course, there's the regulatory perspective, that environment. Interoperability means that there needs to be some kind of regulatory interchange or understanding, and a very strong consideration to what the differences and nuances that exist outside the borders in which you're deploying a particular system are. So if you're looking at interoperability, even if you aren't necessarily intending to have cross-border be part of what you're building, you need to consider what the impact of other regulations might be, or other regulatory regimes and environments. So you have to think about these differences, and that's what we call the regulatory perspective. And then lastly, this is a bit of overlap with the other 3, is the legacy perspective. And so it is important to recognize that you need to have backwards compatibility with legacy systems. That needs to be considered, as there's going to be at a minimum a transition period during which any new system comes online, and it's going to have to interact with the existing financial infrastructure. So interoperability doesn't just mean that you're talking from a blockchain to a blockchain. You have to consider how are you actually engineering to connect with systems that may not be as technologically advanced or as cutting edge as yours. So in general, we focused an entire paper of our Digital Currency Governance Consortium initiative, which brought together 120 people from 80 entities are all around the world. And we focused on this topic because it's just so important in order to realize the efficiencies we all want to see that are part of the point of why digital currencies are being considered in so many different jurisdictions. And we also walk through some of the trade-offs, the benefits, the incentives that can arise, and things like that. Sometimes actually friction can be beneficial, right? You may not want things to be truly seamless for regulatory or other reasons, business model reasons. So considering that as well, the goal isn't always necessarily to have just something that's super fluid, but to consider where interoperability adds value and where it might be optional or a nice to have as opposed to something that's really critically essential.
That's great. I really like the 4 pillars that you've described there. And as someone who used to be responsible for the RTGS system back in Canada, at the time I was running a 24-year-old legacy mainframe system, and I'm acutely aware of how complicated it is to integrate to those particular infrastructures. You mentioned business model interoperability, and Jason, Partior is a technology platform as well as a payments network, and the value of a payments network is, of course, the size of the network itself. Many networks have notoriously tried to keep closed loop, and so I'd be really curious to know your opinion or views on digital currency interoperability. Over to you, Jason.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, great to be here, and looking forward to Sheila publishing a paper in the near term and reading that. And obviously great to be representing Partior. It's a privilege to represent this company and all the work that's been previously done before me arriving. It's my first week in the role and first media appointment, so I'm glad to be here. In terms of looking at the industry and where we are today, I think, first of all, if we just look more lateral and think about what's happened recently in the COVID era, we've seen infrastructure in many ways come under duress, be that payments infrastructure, be that supply chain infrastructure. So I think, what we're learning at the moment is we have to bring the global infrastructure for many aspects of industry up to the standards of Web 3.0. And it's certainly not there today in our industry. And so I believe there is a huge piece of work that we need to think of as an industry. And we can only do that through close collaboration and working together and knowledge sharing, etc. And there's great industry examples of that happening today in other industries that are adjacent or very different. Now, in terms of the way I think about interoperability, the way I think about open v closed loop, I always take a customer-centric view. But I don't think organizations operate in such a closed environment, and it brings great restrictions. So I think generally speaking, it's important for us to take open operability as a standard and think about how we deploy that through our systems. Now, we then come on to the standards that build into that and how do we work through those. The industry is naturally nascent, and with the pressures to move money more efficiently, we've seen that there has been an acceleration in terms of central banks that are now adopting either a sandbox approach, a learning approach. We've seen China with PBOC work through many different iterations of what they're doing before they're really allowing digital currency and programmable currency to move forward. So I do think this is an important inflection point in the industry. I still believe it's very nascent, but I think it's very important that as a mindset, as industry leaders, we collaborate and we approach this in the correct standards. And I think the way that Sheila laid this out in the 4 pillars resonates very strongly with me as well. So ultimately, my vision for Partior, the board's vision for Partior, is an interoperable, open, and inclusive technology platform.
Great, and I really like your point on resilience as well. I think that's really well said. Brian, from a more technical perspective, how do we view these different models of interoperability? CBDC projects like Jasper and Ubin over the past few years established API, application layer connectivity on a deeper protocol layer. Hyperledger Bisu as an Ethereum client could be viewed as an example of interoperability for a DLT protocol level. So perhaps you could describe what's a good way to understand these different models of interoperability.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to understand it. Interop is not about the technology so much as it's about where the standards and the implementations come from, and really the point of it is to drive optionality and therefore competition between the providers of these platforms and technologies in the interests of the end users. The banks, the other financial industry partners, and ultimately of the consumers. So to try to frame it, let me talk about the opposite of what standards are, which is simply public APIs like AWS S3 or Twilio. These are public, they're published. In fact, there might even be alternate implementations of it, but you're never going to find a governance model around this besides what does Amazon say it is, what does Twilio say that it is. So it has to be about something that's collaboratively built, collaboratively iterated upon, and tested out in the market, and really driving lower costs. And it's not really good enough to say, here's a commercial product, here's some open APIs, or even, we're interoperable between different implementations of our code. It's not even enough to say, here's open source code, good luck, and if you need help, call company X. If the company X is the only provider of support and services around that common code. It's really about these multiple implementations where people can be both consumer and producer on either side of that protocol, where there's conformance testing, so that buyers can be smart about who they partner with, and that the whole thing is really about driving lower prices and ultimately lower switching costs or exit costs from one technology to another. Usually that's accelerated by having a governance model, whether it's in open standards bodies like ISO or the IETF, for example, and generally accelerated by having common open source code that represents the table stakes, what everybody needs to do so that most companies can devote their R&D money on actually differentiating technology on the layers above. In the Hyperledger ecosystem, we've seen both examples of this with Fabric, where it was certainly built collaboratively between a whole set of companies, IBM and Oracle and Walmart's contributed, all sorts, as well as a very long tail of small companies. And there's multiple providers of these products and services. So people building on top of Fabric know they can hire IBM, but they can also hire a very long list of other providers around that. Besu goes even a step further, where not only are there multiple companies now selling products and services based on Hyperledger Besu, it's an implementation of the Ethereum stack. So it actually builds on top of the tremendous amount of activity and goodwill out there in the Ethereum ecosystem and knowledge about how to build dApps and how to manage that kind of infrastructure, and is even driving towards convergence with Quorum, one of the other major Ethereum enterprise platforms, so that you'll be able to essentially be running both those nodes of software on the same network. But finally, I want to point out, interop is not just about, is everybody running Besu or is everybody running Fabric? Even with those being, well-managed, distributed open source projects, it's also about how do we tie these between each other? How do we build links that can allow transactions across them? And that's where interoperability solutions like Hyperledger Cactus or folks like the Cosmos Network, I want to give due credit to them as well. And then finally, we have to make this evident to the end users. And so I think what we haven't seen yet are really standards for wallets. How are we going to manifest portable digital assets to individuals, to citizens, to businesses that will be conducting transactions across different central bank digital currencies and other digital assets? So the more that we can drive interoperability at that endpoint, the more we can make the wallet like a web browser rather than something that's hard coded to one exchange or to one financial institution. I think the better off we'll all be.
Oh, that's amazing. And governance and portability are the keywords that stuck out for me. But before we get on to standards, Ricardo, I'd like to go over to you. Corda is an open source DLT platform that's used by many different applications across a number of enterprise use cases. So how does Corda enable connectivity, and how does it compare with these other interoperability models and solutions we've discussed thus far?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for having me and for inviting us to speak. So from the beginning, when we built Corda, interoperability and connectivity is really critical. And I think the way that Sheila positioned that, there's regulatory, there's business, there's technical interop. And, we are a technology company, but of course, the business and the policy side really impacts the way that we address connectivity. And for us, if I look at the technical side, kind of break that down into integration. And integration for us is really looking at legacy, and Sheila touched on that as well, kind of the legacy integration of, databases, key systems of record, identity systems, which is really critical, arguably even harder to fix than payments, really, but really critical kind of components in the current world. So integration to the legacy systems is critical, and then interoperability. And for us, interoperability comes in a number of forms. So it's making sure that within a Corda network that has separate security subzones or separate subnet networks, those things can interoperate whilst maintaining privacy within those subnetworks. And then interoperability of private to private Corda networks, and then finally interoperability of chains. But I think all of that is quite low level. To Brian's point, I think the goal really is to make sure that everything is as seamless as possible to allow users to have choice. And so the work that we've been doing more recently is really to enable the seamless movement of assets across ledgers, true PVP, DVP. And there's a number of projects that we've been working on more recently that have accelerated some of that work. So I love the framework that's been presented. I think if we stick to our wheelhouse on the technology side and really on the platform side, the goal is to be open, to be fully interoperable and seamless, and to allow these assets to be as fluid as possible.
Thanks, Ricardo. I think that's a really good segue to the next kind of section of the discussion, which is that of standards. And one possible model for further interoperability is, of course, having platforms and applications that speak some sort of common language and eliminating the need for middlewares and translators potentially, and simply allow more direct and native connectivity. So again, leading squarely into the realm of standards. So maybe back to you, Sheila. Many of us in the payments ecosystem are very familiar with things like ISO 20022. What are the other types of standards that might be relevant in context of this central bank digital currency interoperability discussion from your perspective?
Well, unsurprisingly, I'm going to go back to the framework I laid out. And so I think there's a need for technical standards, business standards, regulatory standards, as an example. And so having some kind of agreement about where we're going to align on some of these things is going to be quite valuable. And of course, those involve different kinds of groups that need to come together and come to an accord or an understanding about that. We also, there are several initiatives underway that we're tracking with a lot of interest. I'll start with the one that we're most involved with, which is called the Global Standards Mapping Initiative, that's led by the Global Blockchain Business Council and the Forum. And that really is actually meant to be a catch-all. It's a survey of what standards do exist. It's beyond just the currency space. It's looking at blockchain as a general matter, as an industry, and what standards are being created out there. And it kind of provides this overview of what's happening, so people know what's the work that's underway and how can maybe they leverage it or tap into it or join it even and help further it. There's work happening on tokenization and smart contract standards. Interwork and others are working on this. There's market and conduct standards and kind of best practices around digital currencies. Global Digital Finance and others are doing this. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't really mention the critical work happening in identity. Ricardo mentioned that's almost a predicate to really being able to scale some of these solutions that are being developed. Identity standards are again underway all over the place. I want to give special mention just quickly to Digital Currency Global Initiative, which is this collaboration between ITU and Stanford that we have been again tracking and involved with as well. And the idea here is that thinking about certifying interoperability as a standard itself, and this is for CBDC and of course for stablecoins as well, and having a common method for actually being able to, I don't want to say grade, that sounds too punitive, but assess essentially and certify that a particular system is interoperable and meets certain kinds of requirements for what you would deem to be an interoperable system is something that could really help what we think level the playing field and then really focus attention on projects that are oriented in such a fashion, to the extent that that's important to any particular issuer. Now, ITU T-Study Group 16, which SG16 is how it's called, started this work in 2019, and it's really come, I think, quite a long way. I'll just briefly talk about, they divide this into two different types of interoperability. One they call north-south interoperability, and one they call east-west interoperability. And the first, just very briefly, and this is just kind of indicative of kind of the level of detail that some of these initiatives are getting into and the complexity around this. That one really focuses on applications and the underlying platform, right? So of course, recall that we're looking at blockchain interoperability, and then there's application interoperability, and those are sometimes different things, but they're very tied together. So how do you think about the communication that's happening on the communication protocol? And that can be something that was really going to help promote and push almost the compatibility of systems that underlie these different various applications. And then this east-west interoperability really is focusing more on interchain operability. And so it could involve systems that use the same protocol, different ones, cross-chain communication, and things like this. It also encompasses the notions that we've already spoken about on this session today of governance, identification, things like this, and also, some of the measures you might take to create accountability. So punishment mechanisms, deterrence mechanisms as well, and things like that are, of course, really important. So again, there's a lot of really exciting work in this space. It's all really critical work. And our hope is that as this continues to evolve and develop, it'll provide a basis for those who are building these systems to be able to assess via whether it's formal certification or just kind of checking against these different things that are being developed via these initiatives, whether or not they are building a forwards compatible, essentially, system, or whether they're going to remain somewhat isolated, which again could be desirable, and we don't mean to sneeze at that, but certainly the direction of travel seems to be that the more interoperable systems are, the more they're going to be able to scale and the more valuable we're going to have on a global scale.
Thanks, Sheila. I mean, I think what you've outlined just really reinforces the fact to me that standards are hard and multidimensional and complex in nature. And maybe, Ricardo, R3's been, in this for 5 or 6 years, to my knowledge, and I think probably a participant in many of these standards-related discussions over the years. Where do you think we've done well in terms of the development of standards, and where are we most lacking today from your perspective as a participant in these discussions?
I'll piggyback off kind of the north-south and east-west. I think that's an interesting kind of view. On the north-south, if I understood that right, Sheila, that's on the application level. So we've done really well. We've done really well at the allowing applications to talk together. We started off with RPC. APIs is obviously kind of the general approach. So from an API perspective, we see more and more of that. And so, we've seen some of those bridges and some of those interop solutions using APIs in order to interoperate between separate systems. So from an application perspective, I think we've done well. Quarter-specific, database integration, allowing different databases to be switched in and out. Using oracles as a way to interoperate or bring in data from the existing world, if you like, into these networks, into these DLT networks. So those kind of things I think we've done really well. HSMs, bringing in, adopting current security modules for identity and certification, etc. So on that side of things, I think we continue to do well. There's more work to do there, of course. On the interop side, I think we've talked cross-chain. I think there's a ton of work to be done there. We've seen some innovations. We've talked about, HTLCs and other solutions that we've seen on the bridge side, but still a lot of work to be done there. But fundamentally, I think, this is mentioned a couple of times, I think a precursor to all of this is identity. That one continues to be super hard. And that one to me would be the one that if you had to call out kind of the one thing that I think we need to address would be identity before we can look at kind of the interoperability of money more generally.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree on the identity piece. My personal opinion is it is indeed harder than payments by an order of magnitude, probably. Brian, the flip side of standards. I mean, as I've mentioned, standards are hard. They're often slow to be developed, and some would argue they could even impede innovation. But maybe from your perspective, how could we draw some inspiration and insight from the open source community as to when and where standards are truly needed?
Sure. Well, responding just really quickly to Ricardo's observation, which I share, but I'm actually a lot more optimistic. There's been quite a bit of movement, both in the standards and in the implementation, around a very different, but actually a much more, I think, aligned with all of our interests here, model for digital identity called self-sovereign identity. The standards relevant there are for verifiable credentials, DIDs, and there's an organization called the Trust Over IP Foundation that's been doing a good job in describing how you pull these different building blocks together into trust frameworks. The DID and verifiable credentials work happening at the W3C, I wanted to mention. Anyways, I'm really optimistic there, and folks should check those out. The broader question about whether standards bodies impede innovation, broadly stated, standards bodies are not where innovation happens, or at least not where it should be expected to happen. The best thing for standards bodies to do is to really turn best ad hoc practice into something more refereed, something more accepted by a larger set of stakeholders, generally with a better, more formal way to describe the structure of that standard, and with a better documentation and perhaps a better behavior around those standards than first efforts made by kind of either individual companies or individual developers are likely to tend to have. And these days, most of the standards efforts I see out there, whether in very formal groups like ISO or IEEE, or in the more agile forms like the Trust Over IP Foundation, they tend to be about codifying the interfaces first, or perhaps best defined by open source projects. Open source projects tend to have this really beneficent kind of purpose there. Once we all agree we have the same challenge, the same problem we're trying to solve, it's much easier for us to pick up a common piece of open source code to solve that than to independently build it ourselves, or try to find vendors, and then for the vendors to try to be interoperable between them. So you'll typically see that, and this goes back to the earliest days of the internet, SMTP, HTTP, DNS, all of these first had their implementations, and most successfully by open source projects, and then they were kind of codified into standards as time went on. But most important, I think one of the real struggles we have, whether it's in standards bodies or it's in software, is sheer amount of duplication of effort that takes place out there. There are an awful lot of people, and I mean both at the developer level and at the business level, convinced of the novelty of their own solutions, much more so than they are willing to spend time learning how others work, and seeing a lot more value in building a proprietary advantage by saying, no, I've got a completely soup to nuts different way of doing it that's radically different and better, rather than figuring out who out there has 80% of what I need and I can build the 20% that adds to it, right? And sometimes that's accelerated by interest in cryptocurrencies and token economics, because now I'm much more financially incented around minting a whole bunch of coins of my own and getting people to use my standard, rather than participating to one where a lot of those assets have already been handed out. So whether in code or in standards, I think that's our biggest challenge, is fighting what is 20 different approaches to solving the same problem sometimes. And optionality is not bad. Competition is not bad at all, of course. But how do we align incentives to get people to give up a little bit to be able to use commonness across these two different dimensions is something I think a lot about.
That's fascinating. I really like that comment around incentives and how that drives behavior. So we'll shift into sort of more specifically around this kind of construct of, you know, multi-CBDCs or multiple wholesale or even retail CBDCs, which is something that we're working on through Project Dunbar here at the Innovation Hub Center in Singapore, looking at a common platform to enable multi-CBDC settlement. Some of the inefficiencies in the existing wholesale settlement markets in particular are top of mind for us. I'll go to Jason first, and then maybe Ricardo after. You know, how do you guys approach as partners on our project? I should add, Partio and R3 are both involved in this Project Dunbar that we're currently running. And you know, so how would a common platform that would allow for transacting parties to implicitly agree on a common standard improve things, and how would standards look like on a common or shared platform? Jason, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think first of all, you know, even before Project Dunbar, Partio is the birth child of Project Ubiquitous. And as that project developed over 5 years and some of the challenges that the industry would face, it was logical for this organization to be built, and the solution that we today are launching to evolve. But I think when I look at this industry, and you know, coming back from fintech and previously been in infrastructure and coming back into the infrastructure and platform business, it's interesting when I look at the industry as a whole, because payments and money movement more broadly is a massive industry. And when we go through such volatile change management, it's often driven by the customer, the end user, the business. And I think that is what we're seeing here, that we're seeing a necessity to move money quicker, more transparently, more efficiently, more economically. And that demand has grown and become more trying for us in an industry. And then we've seen the growth and acceptance of crypto more broadly. You know, I don't want to take a personal agenda on crypto here, but I think ultimately that has also forced the industry to think. So we have a situation today where we're going through industry change management, whether we like it or not. And we have to adopt that. And it's also very difficult because it's a huge industry, and one that's been formed over, you know, hundreds of years, not even tens of years. So legacy, the existing paradigm, the existing policies, systems, and approach is going to be challenged naturally. So we're going through a system of self-disruption, and we have to self-disrupt. And I think it's great if we can align on that. We can be collegiate in knowing that we're doing that, because then the conversation, whether it be a challenge around identity or whether it be a challenge around the way that this new system challenges the perception of liabilities, because consensus challenges the perception of liabilities. I think all of these things need to be approached in an open and transparent way as an industry. But if we look to fintech, where I've just spent the last 5 years, you know, fintech has been challenging a lot of these standards in Asia more broadly for over 10 years. And laterally in the West, over the last 5 years, we've seen fintech grow. And a lot of the things that we're discussing today, you know, the core of fintech is identity. And some of the standards that have been achieved in terms of risk and fraud are world-class. You know, there's a perception that fintech maybe runs at a sub-regulatory threshold. That's not my experience. I mean, everything was centered around identity in my business, and then how we can look at that from profiling, how we can look at that from investment, etc. And I think in fintech, we also use sandboxes with regulators a lot more fluidly and in a lot more engaged way. And I think this particular project, as we look at Dunbar, is a great example of how we come together, how we look at the problem cohesively in the same way, and then how do we create systems that can not just work on 1, 2, 3, 4 domestic rails, but actually how can this connect more globally? How can we have domestic systems and international systems working symbiotically? How can you create more instantaneous acceptance clearing and information sharing? So I'm very, very positive about this project. I think it's super important. When we look at the existing infrastructure, how do we operate with that? And how do we bridge between those policies? How do we bridge between those economics, and how do we bridge against those systems? And I think the more that we learn from the way that fintech has operated in change management, I actually think we can move very quickly. So the actual approach of Project Dunbar for me is something I've really enjoyed. I've been learning from the team. I'm just entering into the project. I think it's super exciting. And then to work with industry colleagues like our three in this and actually say, look, what are each of us bringing to the party? How does the sum of the whole? I think Brian talked about, if I'm 20% and you're 80% together, we're 100%. I have exactly the same mentality. It doesn't need to be an exclusive controlling methodology. I think that will slow adoption, that will slow the industry down. The more that we can be confident in our own purpose and what we're delivering, the more we can work together and drive change management in the industry. And that's really what excited me about this role. And let's not just go on to CBDC. Adoption of technology is often far slower than we anticipate. How old is blockchain now? How old is smart contracts? This isn't new technology. The adoption has been laggard to some degree. So I still think we've got to look at these traditional rails and say, how are we solving for fear? How are we creating standards that allow things to move faster, easier, more quickly? And the learnings we will have that, no doubt, will allow us to have the correct infrastructure for rapid adoption of central bank digital coin too. So very pleased to be in the project with my colleagues.
Ricardo, do you want to build on that at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, I share a lot of that. I think, no one's looking for a megalomaniac world. I think it's important to understand that, the sum of all our parts, I think, will give everyone the options to kind of stand up the right systems. And there's no one way to build these things. So, Project Dunbar is helping us to explore various models, and we're super honored to be participating. And I think we bring a lot of experience to the table. We're working on other projects that are somewhat similar, testing the same kind of models where you've got, shared services within common platforms versus completely independent services on independent platforms. And there's no right or wrong way. It's just providing the right tools and the right approaches, the right, early standards in order to allow these systems to be put together. And I think, the sandbox is a great way to very quickly stand things up. I think we found ourselves in circular debates over the last couple of years in the industry talking about, is it this color or that color? Should we go left or right? And it's really powerful to be able to stand up a sandbox that at least allows us to build things quickly and tear them down and just really explore the impact of these things. So I share those views. And also just stepping back a little bit to Brian's point around emerging standards, I think that's really powerful. I think if we wait to write all this down, I think we'll be waiting a long time. And so just allowing these things to happen via sandboxes, via these early implementations, I think is a good way to at least see some leading indicators on what we think makes sense in terms of those early standards. And I heard interfaces earlier. That's a great way to start, very simple interfaces that we could start with. But, for Project Dunbar specifically, if you look at a shared platform, and Andrew, that was your question, you tend to, and again, not just Project Dunbar, but Project Jura as well, which is a really exciting project, as you know, Andrew, and others as well, with the French and the Swiss Central Bank, the BIS as an observer. Those are looking at the same things. What are the shared services that you need, and therefore, quote unquote standards, things like rule books and identity systems and governance systems, are pretty key. So those things you may reuse, network tools, etc. And you may even, of course, share a single infrastructure in a single platform. Now, would you do that for a global setting? You know, we don't necessarily subscribe to that model, as we mentioned earlier. But I think looking at these regional networks and how these things might evolve then allows you to understand, well, what common services would be required within these regional networks. So just assume a Eurozone, for example. And so those are the shared services that you might see, but then within those sub-networks, you'd have your own private services and features as well. Things like your asset management, your collateral management systems, perhaps. So I hope that provides a little bit of our view. I think, you know, there's some very, very practical things that you can pick out and say, these things we need to agree on. Let's agree the rule book, let's agree the whitelist, let's agree the identity so that at least we know who's in the system and who to trust. And then there's other services that will be proprietary to hold kind of privacy of data, etc. I'll stop there.
No, that's some great comments, and I think that builds on some of the stuff Brian said earlier in terms of where you can agree on those common elements are almost commoditized, and then where companies can add value on top. And Brian, I mean, Ricardo also mentioned some early implementations and regional models. The Hyperledger family is involved in a number of projects to my knowledge. In Cambodia, Project Bakong was built by Sorimitsu on Iroha. And the Adhara group is building on Project Bisu with their partners in Finality. So if you could bring all of these kinds of initiatives together to design a digital currency solution, how important would standards and interoperability factor into your design?
Yeah, so the standard that's used for the ledger layer is interesting, and I think that we'll start to see a smaller set of common platforms that are used there. But it's really, that's the database, right? And the really interesting stuff is what's built on the layers above. And I mean that, in the terms of software for the bank governors, for the regulators, for the associate banks to plug into that, software that plugs into the back office systems, all the things Sheila talked about as being really critical when you think about systemic adoption of these technologies. And I think there's a whole lot of software yet to be written that helps manifest kind of an interoperability story and a shared story around wallets. Most of the wallets today, with rare exception, are not open source, and they are tied to one specific market exchange or one specific bank or the otherwise, or you have Apple Wallet and Google Wallet, right? And you really don't have the Firefox of wallets out there. So I think that's where there's still a fair bit of work to do. But I think what we're doing right now is really an exercise in mapping the landscape. All these different projects, the pilots, even the stuff that's moving into production, is still part of a 5 to 10 year window, I think, that looks very much like the early days of operating systems or even the early days of the web. Like, let's explore the features of that landscape first. Let's get some real traction and the operational experience behind what are the right consensus mechanisms to use, what are the right ways to tie into other third-party systems. And I think what will emerge out of that is one or two very clear winners. And I would say likely those are going to be the open source platforms. And then really it's about this extra layer on top. And I mean, at Hyperledger, we've been polling our membership around what should we be doing in the central bank digital currency space, what are things we could do to make the platforms more appropriate. We know that there's even some central bank projects. Well, first off, we've loved the investment that MAS and others have made in Project Ubin and now with Dunbar, with BIS and a bunch of other partners. We think that's the right way to continue mapping that landscape. My hope is that all the code that's written in the hackathon ends up becoming not just kind of one-off, proofs of concept, but actually making their way into shipping product and the like. I think it's important enough that we get it right now that we should tolerate a little bit of optionality and a little bit of brown noise, Brownian motion, if you will, right? And then move on from that to something more common and centralized over time. And at Hyperledger, we fully anticipate being the home for a lot of these kinds of related initiatives from the ledger layer on up.
I mean, there's so much amazing kind of engineering and creativity going on, within the Hyperledger family, at R3, within the whole spectrum, even the Ethereum ecosystem. And maybe that's a good segue. We've talked a lot about CBDC standards and interoperability. which takes a forward and kind of medium-term view in many cases. We do need to acknowledge that in some form stablecoins exist today, and there is a certain degree of interoperability inherent there. So maybe Sheila, if you would venture into the noisy space of stablecoins for a minute and kind of give us some examples of stablecoin interoperability and what do you think we could learn there, and how does a WEF approach that space?
Sure. Well, it's important to note, of course, that stablecoins are generally operating on top of a distributed ledger technology architecture. They're on a DLT. And so the interoperability of that architecture is, of course, going to play a key role in interoperability. We talked a bit about the kind of the protocol layer interoperability and the application interoperability. But we kind of tend to think about this falling into a couple of different scenarios just to kind of create another framework here. So the first I would say is really, how are you transferring different stablecoin types on the same blockchain? So you've got a sender and receiver, and you're trying to kind of interoperate between the different types. The next is the same type, but the blockchains are different. So the kind of underlying protocol is different. And the third is different and different. So it's a different stable coin that's on kind of a different blockchain. And so all of these are being explored in the current landscape. There's kind of been seen a need for a demand side for all of these different things. And so thinking about, how you're going to get a thing to the other thing is of course, always of great interest. So I think there's a couple of projects. Again, there's a lot of activity happening in this space. Cactus, which is Hyperledger's integration tool, of course, Interledger protocol. Digital Asset has Canton, of course, and then I'm trying to think of those Optics, by CLab. And then, of course, Polkadot, there's specialized chains that Polkadot has that are looking at each application and its interoperability and thinking about all of these are really kind of looking at how do you create a network of these blockchains and how do you make sure that they're all, you can securely transfer this data. And most certainly it's looking at this interoperability between the challenge, I think I should put it that way, is the public open permissionless kind of systems and the private permission systems and kind of moving things from one to the other. So I think we expect to see, a lot more activity in this space as we see stable coins becoming more and more used as kind of an intermediary kind of thing to transfer value from one system to another. We're going to have to wrestle with, the technical challenges, business challenges, regulatory challenges, all these things. I personally am really looking at what's happening in the United States. I think many of us are around stablecoin regulation, what I think is actually going to pave the way and provide kind of a pathway, to some of this interoperability. I wouldn't say anyone's waiting for any regulation to come down in this. This build is happening very actively now, and the examination exploration is happening now. Nevertheless, regulation, I think, in this particular space is poised to play a more significant role in what ultimately winds up being implemented, because that's just obviously a really critical factor.
I think that's some great comments, and maybe staying in the crypto space here for a second. And we've mentioned Ethereum. One of the reasons why that platform has had, in my opinion, the large mind share, if not, the actual share of stable coins and other digital assets is around the wide adoption of these standards that exist in that network. So the ERC20 standard in particular comes to mind. So would anyone be willing to kind of opine on what we could learn from something like that ERC20 standard, and should we be adopting that, or defining something entirely new for central bank digital currencies? Maybe I'll start with you, Jason.
Thanks. So, I think first of all, let me talk. This is more my view as I come into the industry, or this sector of the industry, should I say. And so please excuse me, it's a very open and transparent view. I think first of all, I see this as very nascent, extremely nascent. I think for me, and please don't take this as a personal challenge, it's just opinion, it may be wrong, maybe right, I don't know. I think it's far too early to talk about winners and losers. I'm not even sure who's on the dance floor. And we're already talking about winners and losers. I don't think we're there. And certainly for the people that we serve, our customers, be they merchants and be their end users, I don't think we got their confidence. So I think it's far too early to talk about winners and losers. And when it comes to policy, it's a term I'm very careful of, because policy should be about mass adoption and protection of liabilities rather than market share. Emerging policy and standards for non-regulated currencies, I don't see them and some of the technology been appropriate to central bank regulated currencies. And I think it's really important we talk about non-regulated and regulated currencies entirely different, because the risk to the end user is significantly different. And, you know, we've seen that. I was reading an article just last night about many individuals who are complaining about one significant brand, an exchange where they've lost a lot of money. We can't continue to operate and close our eyes to what's happening, whether that be organizations using, you know, hiding behind anonymity and carrying out businesses that are illicit. We have to stop that. And just the way we need to stop it with fiat currency that's been used because we can't track it. So I think there is a need to really separate our thinking around regulated and non-regulated currencies and think about what the world needs to be a safe, open and honest place. So that's number two. You know, first of all, I think we're still forming and stalling as an industry on this. And secondly, really thinking about what do we need in terms of technology policy, etc., for a regulated currency to operate digitally in real time. The last point really then, I think about liabilities and control. Sometimes when policy is developed in industry, it's about control. And we see this with technology as well. It can be used negatively to control. And you know, I'm not going to point out the obvious, but I think there's some large brands around the world that are going through a very negative context at the moment because of this. And so policy should be around mass adoption. It should be about reducing friction. It should be about protection. And then because of that, the way we operate is going to change. We talk a lot about identity today, and more than I anticipated. But realistically, there is a link between identity and risk. And so how are we going to think about consensus and real time when it comes to liabilities? It can't be a hot potato that we throw. So I think there's some real, you know, first of all, I feel it's exceptionally nascent at the moment. And I think central banks, 60% of central banks plus are looking at sandboxes and projects to work out. I think that is exactly the way we should be working, looking at our local domestic issues, looking at our infrastructural issues, looking at the technology requirements, looking at standardizations, whether they're smart contracts, where it's the tokenized management and the address of that management, looking at the policies for mass adoption, understanding how liability will work in a consensus environment. I think there's some huge challenges for adoption. And because of that, I think it's nascent. And because of that, some of the work that we're working on at the moment in terms of these industry movements, I know MAS is leading strongly in the space, supported by BIS and other organizations. I think that is exactly the right approach. But I would say to the industry and my colleagues, you know, the more we are open about the massive challenge ahead of us in change management in this industry, the more we will have impact. The more we try and segment at this stage, I think the less fruitful that will be. So my approach is certainly going to be work together and learn.
Thank you, Jason. There's a couple questions from the audience, but we are a little bit tight for time. So what I'll try to do is just paraphrase and give Ricardo, Sheila, and Brian just a quick second to kind of opine on me trying to synthesize a couple of these questions into one. But essentially, you know, thinking about central bank digital currencies, coming back to that space, obviously there's countries, you know, forging ahead. MAS is doing a retail global challenge in terms of defining what a retail, you know, domestic CBDC might look like. Other countries, smaller and large nations, you know, getting dangerously close to live or are live in deployment. But there's also a lot of activity in this wholesale multi-CBDC space as well, as we've talked about today. So from your perspective, you know, which comes first, I guess, you know, is it countries that are, you know, focused on getting their domestic CBDC solution in market, and then we introduce kind of the cross-border element? Is it vice versa? So is cross-border a benefit that comes after you do a retail CBDC, or should we be thinking more broadly now about cross-border and those use cases, regardless of the state of kind of the domestic strategy? So maybe I'll start with you, Sheila, and just being cognizant of time, we've got about probably a minute each-ish.
Oh boy. Okay, I'll try to speed through. You know, I'm just going to really say it depends on what the problem is a central bank is trying to solve. And so that's really something that central banks have to decide. We issued a CBDC policymakers toolkit in 2020, and that's still very much in use today to help assess like what is the point of this entire exercise in the first place. So I would say, just to add to that, it is important to make sure in your design that you are foreshadowing, let's call it, the need for, there will be a cross-border engagement model at some point, or business model at some point. But to me, it's less about, are you starting domestic and going, cross-border, or are you starting cross-border and going domestic? It's really like every central bank has to make that decision, and it's really a policy decision on, honestly, more than anything else. But I would say you'd be remiss to not foreshadow or build something that is going to be applicable in the other context, whether or not that's where you intend to start.
Awesome. Brian, over to you.
The simplest thing I could think of to say is it does seem like bank-to-bank and cross-border wholesale payments are going to be a whole lot simpler, lower-hanging fruit to try to tackle than consumers and retail. I mean, that's obviously where there's a lot of complexity, a lot of touch points, a whole lot of, consumer acceptance of software is a very finicky thing. So I would definitely focus on the back office first. I'm also a believer in duocracy. So go forth and solve all the problems where there's resources to solve them, for sure.
Awesome. Ricardo, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. So first of all, I think it's right to say it really depends what you're trying to solve for. But if you had to be really practical, and Brian touched a little bit on that, I think if you bifurcate cross-border payments between wholesale and domestic, it seems to me like certainly the work we've been doing, domestic wholesale is where you start, try and solve for that. Look at wholesale cross-border, and then you can really tackle some of the retail stuff. If you wanted to do it all, if you wanted to eat the entire elephant, maybe that's how you'd start. But there's many, many different ways. Again, Andrew, it really depends what you're trying to achieve.
Fantastic. I really enjoyed the discussion today, everyone. Thank you so much for making time. It's been a very engaging and informative discussion for me, and I hope the audience as well has enjoyed it. And again, really appreciate everyone's time participating from the audience, from the panelists, and wishing you all a wonderful day or evening wherever you may be. So thanks again.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all our panelists today. I think if there's one thing we can all take away from this, I quote Brian. I think he puts it very appropriately into one word: duocracy. We all learned one new word today. And yes, it's about what we can do and what we should be doing and what else can be done as well. I think that's a very, very appropriate way to end it. And with that, that's all the time we have for you today. Before you go, please don't forget to fill up the poll that will be coming up on the screen very, very shortly. If you're an attendee, we appreciate your feedback. It's very, very important to us, especially, things which we can do as we move into the 2022 season. With that, we've come to the end of the Green Shoot series this year, and we look forward to everyone joining us again next year. But before we go, one last thing: Singapore FinTech Festival coming up again next month, literally a month away. Tickets are available for purchase. Early bird prices actually ends tomorrow, and after that, prices double for tickets. You can purchase them from our website by scanning the QR code that's appearing on the screen right now, and you can find out more about the special learning program I mentioned at the start of Green Shoots there via the QR code as well. On behalf of the team at SFF, everyone that support us, the people behind, and of course, all the speakers that have joined us and the moderators, thank you, and we hope to see you at the Singapore FinTech Festival in November. Thank you. Bye-bye.